No Contest. The Case Against Competition. By Alfie Kohn. Acknowledgements. For almost every person who writes a book, there is a circle of friends, relatives, and if the author is sufficiently preoccupied with the project, even casual acquaintances who have been subjected to conversation about it. A well-known writer once turned me down for an interview, claiming he didn't like to talk about whatever he was working on at the time lest his energies be drained. This still baffles me. For the last 10 years, I'd been eager to talk about competition with anyone who spoke English. The many discussions that resulted have refined my thinking on the subject immeasurably, and I'm grateful to those who have listened and questioned and argued. The same goes for those who spoke up after more formal talks I've given in the Boston area and for my students at Tufts University and the Cambridge Center for Adult Education who wrestled with the topic for an entire semester. No one had to put up with more than those who live, or have lived, in the cooperative house I lived in for 5 years: Carol Hetrick, Phil Corman, Ellen Carlino, Marianne Takas, Jeb Brugman, Claudia Cahan, Bob Irwin, Carol Durga, Don Bishop, and Lynn Weiss. My interest in competition can be understood in this context. I am fascinated by questions that seem basic to being human, that address us as whole persons rather than just as disembodied intellects, and that cannot be dealt with adequately within the confines of a single academic discipline. That I have such an orientation is due largely to two people. Rob Bennexson awakened it, prodding me to start reading in psychology and helping me to read critically. George Morgan shaped it, becoming for me a mentor in the best sense of that word, and later, a treasured friend. My original plan was to edit a collection of essays on competition, but it wasn't long before I realized I had a lot more to say than could be contained in an introduction. While I was trying to say it, I pressed drafts of chapters on people whose judgment I valued, hoping for critical readings. I was not disappointed, and I am pleased to thank Laura Schenck, Claire Baker, Phil Corman, Stuart and Estelle Kohn, Susan Hewitt, Marianne Takas, and George Assassin, all of whom helped me to reach a much-needed sense of perspective in addition to suggesting revisions large and small. I've learned about cooperative learning from a number of people since the first edition of this book was published. If I mention only Eric Shapps and David Johnson, it's because they were kind enough to read and comment on my new chapter that deals with the topic. Elisa Harrigan did so, too, but she has my gratitude for a lot more than that. Bill Green's contribution merits a separate paragraph. In view of his agile intelligence, I would have been happy with even a small helping of his help. I was lucky enough to receive more hours than I can count. He read every chapter, said a great deal about them, all of it useful, and forced me to rewrite and rethink much of what follows. Whatever you think of this book, it is far better than it would have been without his help. The legal profession is lucky to have him. With all of this advice and guidance, it would have been a shame to keep the final product all to myself. This is where Larry Kesenick and John Ware came in. Their enthusiasm for the project is responsible for turning it into a published book. I have not only Larry but also Ruth Hapgood, Lois Randall, and Jerry Morse to thank for editing, as well. Let me note, finally, that most of the research for this book was done in the libraries of Harvard University, the size of whose holdings is matched only by the school's determination to restrict access to them. I am delighted to have been able to use these resources, and it hardly matters that I was afforded this privilege only because the school thought I was someone else. At every quarterly examination, a gold medal was given to the best writer. When the first medal was offered, it produced rather a general contention than an emulation and diffused a spirit of envy, jealousy, and discord through the whole school. Boys who were bosom friends before became fierce contentious rivals, and when the prize was adjudged became implacable enemies. Those who were advanced decried the weaker performances. Each wished his opponent's abilities less than his own, and they used all their little arts to misrepresent and abuse each other's performances. Robert Coram, Political Inquiries, 1791. 1. The number one obsession. Life for us has become an endless succession of contests. From the moment the alarm clock rings until sleep overtakes us again, from the time we are toddlers until the day we die, we are busy struggling to outdo others. This is our posture at work and at school, on the playing field, and back at home. It is the common denominator of American life. Precisely because we are so immersed in it, competition can easily escape our notice. A fish does not reflect on the nature of water, Walker Percy once remarked. He cannot imagine its absence, so he cannot consider its presence. Even those who think and write for a living have paid surprisingly little attention to the subject. In the last 50 years, for example, no one has written a book that explores the very idea of competition and the way it plays itself out in all the varied arenas of human life. I do not mean a lament about what has happened to sports today, or a recipe for being a winner in business, or a statistical operation performed on abstractions that issue from experimental games. These roll off the presses regularly. I mean a look at what it really means to try to beat other people, a careful investigation of this arrangement that requires some people to fail in order that others can succeed. If such an analysis is long past due, the need for it is nowhere more urgent than in this country. Different cultures depend on competition to different degrees in structuring their economic system or schooling or recreation. At one end of the spectrum are societies that function without any competition at all. At the other end is the United States. Here is social psychologist Elliot Aronson, from the Little League ball player who bursts into tears after his team loses, to the college students in the football stadium chanting, "We're number one!" From Lyndon Johnson, whose judgment was almost certainly distorted by his oft-stated desire not to be the first American president to lose a war, to the third grader who despises his classmate for a superior performance on an arithmetic test, we manifest a staggering cultural obsession with victory. Others have used similar language. Competition is almost our state religion, says one observer. It is an American cultural addiction, remarks another. Resistance to competition is viewed as suspiciously un-American, notes a third. This does not mean that competition is found only in the United States. The examples offered in this book will likely seem familiar to readers elsewhere. But what may be merely familiar in other places has reached exaggerated, often ludicrous, proportions in this country. We can see this both in the pervasiveness of competitive activities and in the fervor with which we approach them. Our economic system is predicated on competition, while our schooling, from the earliest grades, trains us not only to triumph over others but to regard them as obstacles to our own success. Our leisure time is filled with highly structured games in which one individual or team must defeat another. Even within the family there is rivalry, a muted but often desperate struggle that treats approval as a scarce commodity and turns love into a kind of trophy. Not only do we get carried away with competitive activities, but we turn almost everything else into a contest. Our collective creativity seems to be tied up in devising new ways to produce winners and losers. It is not enough that we struggle against our colleagues at work to be more productive. We also must compete for the title of friendliest employee. The only way we can think of to socialize with the people who work for another company is to try to beat them in a competitive game. If we want to escape all of this by, say, going out dancing, we find that even here we are involved in a contest. No corner of our lives is too trivial, or too important, to be exempted from the compulsion to rank ourselves against one another. Even where no explicit contest has been set up, we tend to construe the world in competitive terms. Several years ago, to cite one small illustration, the New York Times Magazine featured a profile of Placido Domingo that declared he had challenged Luciano Pavarotti, and many say surpassed him, for the title of the world's leading tenor. Opera, too, cannot be enjoyed without our thinking in terms of who is number one. Thus it is that Vince Lombardi's famous comment, "Winning isn't everything, it's the only thing," must be understood not merely as the expression of one football coach's fanaticism, but as a capsule description of our entire culture. Our lives are not merely affected by, but structured upon, the need to be better than. We seem to have reached a point where doing our jobs, educating our children, and even relaxing on the weekends have to take place in the context of a struggle where some must lose. That there might be other ways to do these things is hard for us to imagine, or rather, It would be hard if we were sufficiently reflective about our competitiveness to think about alternatives in the first place. Mostly we just accept it as the way life is. The current celebration of business competition makes these issues particularly timely. Bookstores have been deluged with guides to winning in the marketplace largely because of the rhetoric spilling out of Washington over the last few years. The competition that has been indiscriminately encouraged actually has the effect of shifting power from elected representatives to private corporations, from those who are theoretically accountable to all citizens to those who are, at best, accountable to only the tiny fraction of people who stand to make a profit. Half of all corporate stock is owned by 1% of the population, while 81% of all families own no stock at all. But even if the mystique of corporate success becomes less fashionable after a few years, even if public officials no longer see themselves chiefly as cheerleaders for private industry, our economic system is fundamentally grounded in competition, and an exploration of the subject will continue to be relevant. Moreover, I am concerned in this book with far more than the machinations of the business world. Competition is a deeply ingrained, profoundly enduring part of our lives, and it is time to look more closely at what it does to us. Let us begin with a more precise formulation of the topic. I think it is useful to distinguish between what might be called structural competition and intentional competition. The former refers to a situation, the latter to an attitude. Whereas structural competition has to do with the win/lose framework, which is external, intentional competition is internal. It concerns the desire on the part of an individual to he number one. To say that an activity is structurally competitive is to say that it is characterized by what I will call mutually exclusive goal attainment. Mega, for short. This means, very simply, that my success requires your failure. Our fates are negatively linked. If one of us must lose exactly as much as the other wins, as in poker, then we are talking about a zero-sum game. But in any mega arrangement, two or more individuals are trying to achieve a goal that cannot be achieved by all of them. This is the essence of competition, as several social scientists have observed. The same phenomenon sometimes has been described as a situation of scarcity. This does not explain competition but simply restates it. If I must try to defeat you in order to get what I want, then what I want is scarce by definition. We need to be careful not to confuse this sort of scarcity with the kind that refers to an objective shortage of some commodity. It is possible, of course, for two hungry people to compete for a single bowl of stew. But in most contests, the goal is simply a prized status. Structural competition usually involves the comparison of several individuals in such a way that only one of them can be the best. The competition itself sets the goal, which is to win. Scarcity is thereby created out of nothing. Structural competitions can be distinguished according to several criteria. Competitions vary, for instance, with respect to how many winners there will be. Not everyone who applies for admission to a given college will be accepted, but my acceptance does not necessarily preclude yours, although it will make it somewhat less likely. On the other hand, only one woman in a bathing suit will be crowned Miss America each year, and if Miss Montana wins, Miss New Jersey cannot. In both of these competitions, notice that winning is the result of someone's subjective judgment. In other cases, such as arm wrestling, pre-established and reasonably straightforward criteria determine who wins. Beauty contests and college admissions also share another feature: either requires any direct interaction among the contestants. The success of one simply rules out or reduces the chances for success of another. There is a stronger version of structural competition in which one contestant must make the others fail in order to succeed himself. War is one example. Tennis is another. Whereas two bowlers competing for a trophy take turns doing the same thing and do not interfere with each other, two tennis players actively work at defeating each other. Which of these postures is in evidence depends on the rules of the game, the type of structural competition that is involved. Intentional competition is much easier to define, although its nuances are quite complex indeed, as we shall see later. Here we are simply talking about an individual's competitiveness, his or her proclivity for besting others. This can take place in the absence of structural competition. As all of us have observed, someone may arrive at a party and be concerned to prove he is the most intelligent or attractive person in the room, even though no prizes are offered and no one else has given any thought to the matter. The psychoanalyst Karen Horney described as neurotic someone who constantly measures himself against others, even in situations which do not call for it. The reverse situation, structural competition without intentional competition, is also possible. You may be concerned simply to do the best you can, without any special interest in being better than others, yet find yourself in a situation where this entails competing. Here it is the structure rather than your intention that defines success as victory. Perhaps you are even averse to competing but find yourself unable to avoid it, an unhappy and stressful state of affairs known to many of us. The most extreme case of structural competition without intentional competition is a circumstance in which individuals are ranked and rewarded without even being aware of it. Students may be sorted on the basis of their grades even if they are not trying to defeat each other. The distinction between the two varieties of competition is especially useful in allowing us to make sense of such a scenario. Finally, let us take note of the rather obvious fact that competition can exist among individuals or among groups. The latter does not rule out the former. Even as two corporations or nations or basketball teams are competing with each other, it is possible that the people within these groups can be vying for money or status. Competition among groups is known as intergroup competition, while competition among individuals within a group is called intragroup competition. These distinctions will prove important in later chapters. Competition is not the only way to organize a classroom or a workplace. This is hardly a controversial observation, but because we have come to take competition for granted, we rarely think about alternatives. In this book, following the lead of most social psychologists, I will be considering 3 ways of achieving one's goals: competitively, which means working against others; cooperatively, which means working with others; and independently, which means working without regard to others. Although we sometimes speak of an individual or a culture as being both competitive and individualistic, it is important to realize that they are not the same. There is a difference between allowing one person to succeed only if someone else does not, on the one hand, and allowing that person to succeed irrespective of the other's success or failure, on the other. Your success and mine are related in both competition and cooperation, though in opposite ways. They are unrelated if we work independently. We sometimes assume that working toward a goal and setting standards for oneself can take place only if we compete against others. This is simply false. One can both accomplish a task and measure one's progress in the absence of competition. A weightlifter may try to press 10 pounds more than he did yesterday, for example. This is sometimes referred to as competing with oneself, which seems to me a rather unhelpful and even misleading phrase. A comparison of performance with one's own previous record or with objective standards is in no way an instance of competition, and it should not be confused with it. Competition is fundamentally an interactive word, like kissing, and it stretches the term beyond usefulness to speak of competing with oneself. Moreover, such sloppy usage is sometimes employed in order to argue that competition is either inevitable or benign, since nobody loses when you try to beat your own best time, and since this is a kind of competition, then competition is really not so bad. This, of course, is just a semantic trick rather than a substantive defense of competition. The third alternative, cooperation, will play a more important role in the pages that follow. The word refers to an arrangement that is not merely non-competitive but requires us to work together in order to achieve our goals. Structural cooperation means that we have to coordinate our efforts because I can succeed only if you succeed, and vice versa. Reward is based on collective performance. Thus, a cooperative classroom is not simply one in which students sit together or talk with each other or even share materials. It means that successful completion of a task depends on each student, and therefore that each has an incentive to want the others to succeed. When we think about cooperation at all, we tend to associate the concept with fuzzy-minded idealism or, at best, to see it as workable only in a very small number of situations. This may result from confusing cooperation with altruism. It is not at all true that competition is more successful because it relies on the tendency to look out for number one, while cooperation assumes that we primarily want to help each other. Structural cooperation defies the usual egoism/altruism dichotomy. It sets things up so that by helping you, I am helping myself at the same time. Even if my motive initially may have been selfish, our fates now are linked. We sink or swim together. Cooperation is a shrewd and highly successful strategy, a pragmatic choice that gets things done at work and at school even more effectively than competition does, as I will show in Chapter 3, and can serve as a basis for creating challenging and enjoyable games that do not require us to compete against one another, as I will show in Chapter 4. There is also good evidence that cooperation is more conducive to psychological health and to liking one another. Even in a competitive culture, there are aspects of cooperative and independent work. In fact, a single day at the office can include all three models. The most common mix consists of intergroup cooperation and intergroup competition, working with others in a group in order to defeat other groups. Football players cooperate in order to win, and employees pull together in order that their company can earn higher profits than another company. It should be clear, however, that these orientations do not appear with the same frequency. Notice how often cooperation in our society is in the service of competition, and how often we must compete without being able to cooperate at all. As Robert Bellah and his colleagues put it, the world of individualistic competition is experienced every day. The world of harmonious unanimity is fully realized only in sporadic flashes of togetherness, glimpses of what might be if only people would cooperate and their purposes reinforce, rather than undercut, one another. That most of us consistently fail to consider the alternatives to competition is a testament to the effectiveness of our socialization. We have been trained not only to compete but to believe in competition. If we are asked about it, we unthinkingly repeat what we have been told. Unfortunately, the case for competition, as most of us have learned it, does not stand up under close scrutiny. It is a case that relies on rhetorical gambits, such as the insinuation that people who oppose competition are simply afraid of it, or on a lack of conceptual precision, such as the confusion of competition with conflict or with success. It is a case that sometimes misrepresents itself, such as by disguising the impulse to compete as a simple need to survive. Long ago, Bertrand Russell pointed out that what is often meant by the struggle for life is really the competitive struggle for success. What people fear when they engage in the struggle is not that they will fail to get their breakfast next morning, but that they will fail to outshine their neighbors. Most of all, the case for competition is based on a great deal of misinformation. Specifically, it has been constructed on 4 central myths, and these myths, in the order of their popularity, form the basis of the next 4 chapters. The first myth is that competition is an unavoidable fact of life, part of human nature. Although this assumption is made casually, and without evidence, it demands a considered response. If it were true, arguments about competition's desirability would be beside the point, since there is nothing we can do about our nature. The second myth is that competition motivates us to do our best, or, in stronger form, that we would cease being productive if we did not compete. This assumption is invoked to explain everything from grades to capitalism. Third, it is sometimes asserted that contests provide the best, if not the only, way to have a good time. All the joys of play are said to hinge on competitive games. The last myth is that competition builds character, that it is good for self-confidence. This claim is not heard quite so often as the others, probably because it contradicts not only empirical evidence but our own experience of the psychological impact of competition. I mean to refute each of these myths by looking at all the arenas of human life where competition is present and by reviewing the relevant evidence from such diverse fields as education, social psychology, sociology, psychoanalysis, leisure studies, evolutionary biology, and cultural anthropology. Contributions from philosophy and literature will be included for good measure. Investigating a topic like competition really seems to require this kind of interdisciplinary approach. the territorial inclinations of most scholars have often limited their effectiveness at exploring this and other important questions. These questions sprawl rudely across the boundaries that divide academic specialties. Beginning with a definition of terms, as I have done, is fairly standard. But in this case, being clear about what competition means not only helps to keep the issue in sharper focus, it actually forms the basis of a critique. Strip away all the assumptions about what competition is supposed to do, all the claims in its behalf that we accept and repeat reflexively. What you have left is the essence of the concept: mutually exclusive goal attainment, mega. One person succeeds only if another does not. From this uncluttered perspective, it seems clear right away that something is drastically wrong with such an arrangement. How can we do our best when we are spending our energies trying to make others lose, and fearing that they will make us lose? Can this sort of struggle really be the best way to have a good time? What happens to our self-esteem when it becomes dependent on how much better we do than the next person? Most striking of all is the impact of this arrangement on human relationship. A structural incentive to see other people Jose cannot help but drive a wedge between us and invite hostility. Again, all of these conclusions seem to flow from the very nature of competition. As it happens, they also are corroborated by the evidence, what we see around us, and what scores of studies have been finding. One may not be inclined to consider this evidence, though, until the elemental question has been asked: what do we mean when we speak of competing? The more closely I have examined the topic, the more firmly I have become convinced that competition is an inherently undesirable arrangement, that the phrase healthy competition is actually a contradiction in terms. This is nothing short of heresy because only two positions on the question are normally recognized: enthusiastic support and qualified support. Broadly speaking, the former can be called the conservative position and the latter, liberal. Conservatives champion competition of all kinds, often coming close to Lombardi's dictum about winnings being the only thing. Liberals are typically more restrained, granting that excessive competition is to be avoided and lamenting that our culture now encourages winning at all costs. Competition itself, however, if it is kept in its proper perspective, can be productive, enjoyable, stimulating, and so on. The latter is the view of most of the critics of competition whom I will be quoting throughout this book. It seems to me, however, that they are unwilling to see their intuitions, and in some cases their data, through to their logical conclusion. Perhaps this is because these writers assume that they would lose all credibility if they took the extreme position that competition simply makes no sense, and thus they feel compelled to say that the problem is not with competition, per se, but only with the way we compete or the extent of our competitiveness. Despite the fact that such moderation confers respectability, my conviction that the problem lies with competition itself, and that the extent of this problem is in direct proportion to the degree of competitiveness in a given activity, has been strengthened as I have looked at each of the spheres where it appears. I believe the case against competition is so compelling that parenthetical qualifications to the effect that competing can sometimes be constructive would be incongruous and unwarranted. What follows is an elaboration of this radical critique. After addressing the four central myths of competition, that it is inevitable, more productive, more enjoyable, and likely to build character, I examine its interpersonal consequences in Chapter 6. This is followed in Chapter 7 by a discussion of whether such ugly things as cheating and violence represent the corruption of true competition or its very consummation. Chapter 8 considers the current movement on the part of many women toward becoming competitive, in the same way men are. Chapter 9 reviews the prospects for replacing competition with cooperative alternatives, and the final chapter, new to this edition, focuses on one particularly promising such alternative that allows schoolchildren to learn with each other instead of against or apart from each other. Finally, in an afterword added in 1992, I describe how this book has been received and offer some reflections on signs of change, and of stasis, in our culture since the first edition was published.